What is the state? How does it preserve itself? What does it fear? These are the questions Murray Rothbard uncovers in his powerful book, Anatomy of the State. Thanks to our generous donors, the Mises Institute is offering a free copy of this Rothbard classic to Human Action Podcast listeners. Get your copy at mises.org/HAPod free. That's HA like human action, pod free. This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Jonathan, welcome back yet again to the Human Action Podcast.
Hi, Bob. It's good to be back.
So people are probably at home wondering, what is this guy doing to keep getting on the show? Well, he keeps writing good articles, and the latest was poking fun at Paul Krugman. I was intrigued, but I thought, and I read it, and I said, no, this is valid stuff, and what's amazing to me is how much the left-wing progressives, well, it's sort of, Jonathan, like how they were very much against Nazis until the whole stuff over in the Middle East started flaring up again, and then all of a sudden, Nazi rhetoric wasn't too offensive. Likewise, I have never seen so many economists saying how inflation helps poor people than I have in the last 2 years with Democratic economists. So with that sort of provocative opening, do you want to explain what the thesis is of your latest column?
Sure. I was responding to an article by Krugman where he was basically just saying it doesn't make sense for consumer sentiment to be so low right now because the economy is doing great. We've solved the inflation problem, or at least we're getting close to solving it. And unemployment is still at historic lows. And it seems like, if we look at those sorts of things, there's no reason why consumers should be pessimistic about the economy. So he looks at the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment survey data, and he's comparing how people are reporting what they feel about the economy and comparing it to his interpretation of economic conditions. And he's saying this doesn't match up. And what he found was that there was this study that was done that showed that partisanship explains a part of it. Partisanship explains like 30% of the divergence between the economic conditions and consumer sentiment. And of course, Krugman is blaming this on Republicans. So it's the Republicans who are just mad about Biden being in the White House. And so that is driving their pessimism about the economy in general. And so what I did was I looked at the inside data of the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey, and I found out that they construct this index based on the consumer's answers to a few different questions. They ask questions about what is your household's current financial condition? How do you expect your household's financial condition to be over the next 12 months? How do you think the economy in general is going to go over the next 12 months and 5 years? And then they also ask this question about whether now is a good time to buy consumer durables like furniture or household appliances like a refrigerator. And so when I was looking at it, I was thinking that if Krugman is right, it means that the Republicans, the nasty Republicans who are biasing this survey, they would probably be channeling their distaste for Biden being in the White House through the questions that are about how do you think the economy in general is going over the next 12 months or the next 5 years. So they would be saying they would be reporting, I think Biden being in the White House is not good for the economy. Therefore, I'm pessimistic about the economy as a whole. But what I found is that while those did go up a little bit, the main question that spiked since 2020, especially, was the responses to the question about consumer durables. So it was basically just people saying now is a terrible time to buy furniture. Now is a terrible time to buy a new TV or a new fridge for the house. And so I just think that's probably not realistic or at least it definitely doesn't go along with Krugman's hypothesis here, because you would think that they would be channeling their political partisanship through those other questions, not through the one that's based on the affordability of those big household items. And so I basically just question Paul Krugman's whole hypothesis there about partisanship driving the divergence of consumer sentiment and economic reality. And then at the end of the article, and we can talk about some of these things, I just mentioned a few different things that definitely do not give the consumers a good reason to be optimistic about the economy in general.
Okay, great. So again, folks, big picture is that progressive economists are, normally people that you would think would be aghast and pointing out how much, everything hurts the poor, women, and minorities more than it hurts, the privileged, right? Like that's kind of the standard view among left-wing progressives. And yet this is the one time in history that I can recall where they're explaining how the economy the last couple of years has been really great for the little guy. And hey, it's those fat cats that are finally getting, really feeling the pinch of, I guess, higher egg prices. And by the way, folks, I'm being a little bit snarky, but I am not putting words in their mouth. Literally, many progressive economists are giving charts and things purporting to show that the biggest gainers of the last 2 years have been like the bottom quintile of workers, that they've seen the most gains in terms of their real wages and such. So like, I'm not putting words in their mouth. They're literally saying that. And I guess we can't prove this, Jonathan, but I'm pretty sure if Trump had been in the White House during this period, they would not be saying how much inflation is helping poor people. I don't think they would be saying that.
Yeah, and that was my conclusion at the end, that it seems like Krugman's views here are really driven by his own partisanship. So like it seems like he's the one who's trying to resurrect this narrative of a great economy, and it's obviously because he's on the left and wants Democrats to be elected. So yeah, it definitely seems like they're sort of grasping. They're trying to find all these reasons for people to be optimistic, and therefore when Krugman doesn't see that people are as optimistic as he thinks they ought to be, then he says, well, look, the inflation is back down to 2.5% or 3%, depending on the measure that you look at. And employment is at historic lows. So everybody just needs to be happy. So I think you're exactly right. I think the economists who are doing that sort of thing, they're the ones who are driven by partisanship, not necessarily the average American consumer.
Mm-hmm. Now, and the thing I really liked about your article, and you mentioned it here, but I just want to highlight it just to make sure people didn't miss it, is that you really dug into, not just the headline numbers about, what do people think about the economy, things like that, do they feel unsure or whatnot, but you dug into the specific questions. And again, one of the arguments that people on the left will make to explain this phenomenon, like, gee, how can it be? I mean, we as economists, we're checking all the objective facts here, and the economy is awesome. And yet, for some reason, there's a lot of people that seem to think otherwise. How can that be? And so one theory that is offered is they'll say, oh, maybe people, in their own personal life, their own financial situation's okay. But, in other words, like their pay has more than outpaced the rise in prices at the grocery store, but they don't know that everybody else has gotten raises too. And so they're just assuming, oh, even though we're doing okay, things are more expensive now than they were 2 years ago, but we got my take home pay has gone up too. And actually we're ahead of the game. That's why we're going out to eat more and da-da-da. But surely the fact that everything is so much more expensive must be hurting other people like that. So that's the theory that some have offered to explain this discrepancy in expressed consumer sentiment versus what these progressive economists know the data indicate. And so again, Jonathan, can you just repeat like what did you see in the data that show, no, that's not a good explanation? Like, yeah, maybe everybody's wrong, but it's not that they know their own personal financial situation's great. It's just they're assuming erroneously that, oh, maybe everyone else is getting hurt by these high prices.
Well, the two of the questions that are used in the construction of the index, they ask the consumers to report specifically about their own household. So two of them are about the economy in general, but two of them are specifically about that that respondent's own household. And really, I mean, it's all a wash. Even if you look at the data just on those components of the consumer sentiment index, I mean, they all increased to a greater or lesser extent in 2020. But the one that definitely increases the most is the affordability of consumer durables question. But the point,
and when you say increase, that is a bad thing.
Right. Sorry. So the way that I downloaded the data from the University of Michigan website, it has the actual survey respondent scores, and it goes from 1 to 5, I think, where 1 is great. I'm very optimistic, and then 5 is things are going to hell in a handbasket. So one of the questions is increases of personal financial situation a year from now. And that one looks like that one increased the least going from the 2019 to 2021 period. So like the pre and post COVID. So that one's very specific about that respondent's own household's financial condition. And so it seems like a stretch to think that people are interpreting these questions as they're trying to answer about their neighbors or trying to answer about other people around them. It seems like they would answer according to their own projections of their own household's financial condition, not necessarily try to not do their own sort of subjective interpretation of other people's financial condition and then report on that, but really report on their own. But that one got worse, I should say. That one got worse to a less extent than the other questions, it seems like. And like I said, the one that got the worst was the affordability of consumer durables.
Right. So in a nutshell, it's not merely that people are saying like, oh, I think the country's headed on the wrong path, or yeah, I think the economy's bad, but specific questions like, are you going to buy a new washing machine in the next 12 months? The number of people saying yes to that is lower than like it was before.
Right. And it got, people were very optimistic, or I should say they were, they reported that now is a good time to buy consumer durables. Their ratings on that were very good from like the 2015 to 2020 range, but then it spiked up and got really bad, got really pessimistic after 2020. So what I did was I tried to explain why consumers might report that way. So like, why would they answer that now is not a good time to buy those big purchases for your house? And
I would think the most likely answer is because of the 1-5 numbering being counterintuitive. Maybe they were actually trying to say Krugman's right, and they coded it wrong.
Yeah, almost like a Florida voting problem. But so what I did was I looked at there's a specific subpart of the consumer price index that just pulls out prices of consumer durables. And so in my article, I showed a graph of that. And of course, you don't even need to look at the graph to know that the prices of those things skyrocketed, especially in 2021. But another thing is that I looked at credit card rates, which have also gone up. So average credit card rates were around 15, and then they're up past 20 now. And so a lot of people will buy those sorts of items with their credit cards. And so, I mean, it seems to me like the way that they're responding to the consumer durable question in the University of Michigan survey, I mean, it makes sense. Like, yeah, now is not a good time to buy those sorts of things. The prices are going up, and it's more expensive to finance those purchases if I choose to buy with a credit card. So there's just more evidence to show that it's not Republicans who are angry about Biden in the White House. It's not Republicans who are doing fine economically, but they are trying to bias the survey because they're pessimistic about who's in control. It just seems like at least in this case, the survey respondents are accurately sharing their own interpretation of now is not a good time to buy those sorts of big purchases.
Yeah. So let me draw people's attention. So I'm looking here at Krugman's article called New Perspectives on the Feel Bad Economy from November 14th, 2023. And his opening line is just so ironic. He says, "Almost 2 years have passed since I began trying to draw people's attention to the widening gap between economic perceptions and economic reality." So, right, I agree that 2 years prior to this, there were some people who had this huge gap between their perception and reality, such as Paul Krugman. So let us just take a moment, folks, and remind you that back in, early 2021, Krugman had a debate with Larry Summers, and Summers was warning that the Fed's loose monetary policy and the aggressive stimulus during the COVID era was going to cause unacceptably high price inflation, and and he was worried as a Keynesian that so when the Fed tightens on that, it's going to crash the economy, that kind of thing. Maybe we need to take our foot off the gas. That was his approach. Krugman said he was wrong, that no, the rising prices we've seen are just because of supply bottleneck, and that's the kind of stuff you'd expect. Then by summer of 2021, Krugman, and I haven't been able to find him. Hopefully, folks, in the post-production of this episode, I can get the exact thing and put it in the show notes page. But I distinctly remember it was sometime in the summer of 2021 when price inflation year over year at that point had risen to 5% and change, that Krugman had an op-ed in the New York Times where he declared that price inflation, was done with, and he was mocking the people who had been warning earlier in 2021 about this huge inflation surge. And then he was like, "But funny thing happened that over the summer, those things cooled off." So at that point, he was running victory laps when price inflation at that point year over year was 5% and change. And Krugman thought, "Yep, see, I told you guys, don't listen to Larry Summers." Of course, every month it kept going higher. In December of 2021, that one I was able to find, Krugman has a thing that the Times gave the title to of "The Year of Inflation Infamy," and he wasn't, by that title, he didn't pick the title, they did, but it accurately reflected this tone of his article. He wasn't saying, "Wow, I made some infamously bad predictions." That's not what he was saying at this point. Let me just read a key paragraph near the bottom. He said, or the top of the article, "To preview, I believe," so again, this is Krugman in December of 2021. By the way, at this point, year over year CPI had now crept up to 7% and change, okay? And Krugman at this point says, "To preview, I believe that what we're seeing mainly reflects the inherent dislocations from the pandemic rather than, say, excessive government spending. I also believe that inflation will subside over the course of the next year and that we shouldn't take any drastic action. But reasonable economists disagree and they could be right." All right, so at this point, he is sort of backing off a little bit. Well, month after month, CPI kept ticking up. It got up to like 8.9% year over year at one point. As of July of 2022. And at that point, Krugman has an op-ed in the New York Times saying the title they gave it was, "I was wrong about inflation." And so Krugman finally does admit, hemming and hawing, that, I was a little bit off. So for people who are familiar with Krugman's work, for him to actually come out and admit he was wrong about something is amazing. Now, of course, that all subsided, and now we've come full circle, and Krugman's writing articles about how did mainstream economists get inflation so wrong. And he's like, yeah, these guys were warning about, and so the specific move they're making, and I'm sorry, Jonathan, I know I've been hogging the mic here.
Oh, no, it's fine.
The specific, the move now they're making is they're saying that they call themselves team transitory. He's saying how the inflation was just transitory. It was due to the supply issues from the pandemic and stuff like that. And we don't need to, the Fed doesn't need to tighten, because if it does, that will cause a recession. And so let me just, this was amazing when it happened. So in September of 2023, and I will link to this stuff, folks, Krugman tweets out and says, "We could still have a recession, but it will be a policy error, not something we needed to control inflation that turns out to have been transitory after all." Okay, and so I just want to walk you through just the magnificence of like you have to marvel at him. Like it's what he's casting spells. And so I broke it down, and then I promised Jonathan I will let you speak. So I like retweeted that, and I'm reading here from some news article picked this up, because this was a pretty good tweet on my part that it got some traction. And I said, "I just want to make sure you folks understand how amazing his move is. To review, number one, Summers, meaning Larry Summers, said we need to hike rates to rein in inflation. Too bad that it's going to cause a recession. 2, Krugman said no, inflation is transitory. It will come down without Fed rate hikes, which would only cause a needless recession. 3, the Fed listened to Summers and it jacked up rates hard. 4, inflation comes down. Then Krugman says, see, there's no recession. Inflation was transitory. I was right. And then 5, Krugman admits there still could be a recession, but if it does happen, it will be because of the rate hikes, which were unnecessary because inflation came down without a recession. All right, so I realized I went through that. If you're driving, maybe you didn't want to process that too much as you get into an accident, but it is just amazing the argumentation they use. So in a sense, and Jonathan, you and I covered this a lot in previous episodes of this. We don't need to rehash the whole thing, but yeah, Summers and Krugman were both partially right or both partially wrong in their arguments that right now Summers would have thought there was going to be a lot higher unemployment than there is in order for price inflation to come down. But on the other hand, Krugman also thought Fed rate hikes would have caused a recession. His point was just saying, no, we shouldn't raise rates. Trust me, the inflation will come down on its own. So the fact that the Fed didn't do what Krugman wanted, and now we're in this, this weird thing from a Keynesian perspective where, price inflation came down even though the economy didn't crash. Krugman wasn't predicting that either. So in any event, I said a lot there, Jonathan. What do you have to say about all this?
Well, I was just thinking big picture about differences in economic schools of thought. So I see people post these, sometimes they're memes on the internet, and it's something to the effect of there's consensus in the world of physics about the law of gravity, and there's consensus in the medical science field about the effect of different drugs or how the human body operates. And so they'll ask, well, okay, economists, where do you guys have consensus? And of course, there's hardly any consensus. I mean, there is some consensus, or there's broad consensus on some like basic things like the law of demand or the fact of scarcity, something fundamental, principles level like that. But it's interesting. While you were going through, here's what happened, and here's what Krugman said. Here's what happened, and here's what Krugman said. It just highlighted to me just how difficult it is to achieve economic consensus, even based on everybody looking at the same facts. Like, we're all looking at the same data. I mean, obviously, we quibble about the construction of the data. We quibble about how, like, what is causing what. But it just goes to show that since there's all of this lag, all of these different things that are causing the market outcomes, and they evolve over time. So like a new policy is implemented, and then there's effects over the course of a year or even a decade. It makes it difficult to say this caused this, or this policy was bad because of X, Y, and Z. And so it's just a really recent example of economists not being able to agree simply because we're all looking at the same numbers, and we all have our different theories about, if we have this sort of monetary policy, then there's going to be these sorts of effects. But sometimes the effects take some time to fully kick in or to fully be realized in the data. And so it's easy for Krugman to run these victory laps like you're talking about, saying that we've achieved low employment, and we're getting close to solving the inflation problem. And so he's quickly running the victory lap before there's any other effects going on. And then other people might say, well, probably need to wait and see what's going to happen in 2024. Even the Federal Reserve will say, we haven't seen the full effects of our monetary policy over the past year or so. And so I was just, while you were talking about that, I was just thinking about how difficult it is to achieve consensus in economics simply because we're coming from these different schools of thought.
Well, yeah. I don't know. Did you see, Jonathan, the reaction to the inequality literature? Like, apparently there was some, I think it was in the JPE, Journal of Political Economy, article that was critiquing like the Sayez and Zuckman work on inequality and Piketty.
Yeah, I just saw some headlines.
Okay, well, yeah, so it's fine. But what's amazing to me, and I tweeted this out, too when it happened. So folks, yes, there's this article that's critical of the claims made that inequality is rising at the fastest rate since the Gilded Age and blah blah blah, associated with people like Thomas Piketty and Saez and Zuckman. And and they're arguing back and forth, and they're quoting different people and weighing in from but what was amazing to me, it's not that you would normally expect that, okay, we can all agree on, yep, the top 20% are making X percent more than they used to, and the bottom blah blah blah, and we can point out, well, it's different types of people and stuff. It's if the freshmen at Harvard are 30 pounds heavier this year than they were in the class of 1960. That doesn't mean that all those people just stayed at Harvard for 50 years and kept eating hamburger, right? It's different people. So likewise, when you look at those statistics over time and, the top 20% now earn blah, 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 compared to 1980, it's not the same people. But putting that aside, like here, they don't, you would expect them to be quibbling about that or what's causing it. Yes, we can see the data and we can agree on what changed in the income percentiles and blah, 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 but we think it's because of tax cuts. Well, no, we think it's because of globalization. But they're not even there. They're arguing about whether inequality is increasing a lot or not. That's what's so amazing to me. Like, they can't even agree on what outsiders would presumably think are, standard observations or measurements, up to a point. And it's not like they're quibbling on the margins. Like, it's huge differences depending on which technique you use to try to gauge these things. And I would argue that the people coming up with these really large indications that inequality is soaring, where there's like 5 different dials you have to make a decision about what you're going to do, it seems they always choose to put the dial in just the configuration that would amplify what that measured inequality is. So I'm agreeing with you, Jonathan, that yeah, it really is. And also I would say the amount of area where there's broad consensus just keeps shrinking. Like, it used to be the minimum wage. Like back in the 1980s, even left-wing economists would typically agree that, the way to help low-skill workers is not to jack up the minimum wage because that's just going to throw them out of work. Instead, we should, do whatever, earned income tax credit or whatever, mandated benefits, extra support from the government. But in the 90s, that started to change. So now mainstream economists, we can go ahead. We could have a minimum wage of $20 an hour. That wouldn't do anything, And even you said scarcity. Yes, but some MMT economists might lead you to believe that scarcity isn't really a practical constraint. Like, yeah, we can't just snap our fingers and have space stations around Mars tomorrow, but maybe by next year.
Yeah. So I'm not really sure where to go with that. But maybe we can talk about some reasons why consumers might be justified in being pessimistic. So, like, even thinking more broadly than just the affordability of consumer durables. Maybe we could talk about what sort of things could consumers be looking at besides the fact that their party isn't in power in Washington. What sort of things could they be looking at that would be getting them to think about or getting them to be more pessimistic about the economy in general? And so, like, one thing that I pointed out is the declining quality of both goods and services, and how there's long wait times for things like sorts of things that used to be shipped very quickly from some online vendor now take a long time to be shipped. And I know some of this, like Paul Krugman would blame on supply chain issues that are still being ironed out from the COVID year. But it seems to me like this sort of thing it's a little bit more than that. It seems like there's been like this sea change in customer service and the quality of goods that are being provided, and at the same time there's price increases. So quality is going down and prices going up, wait times are going up, and at least it seems to me like that's at least one good reason to say that consumers are pessimistic about the economy in general, as opposed to just pure partisanship.
Yeah, exactly. And well, I mean, one thing is, not to sound like a Chicago school economist, but I think objectively the economy is in bad shape, and that the future is not, bright for at least the next year. And so just to say, well, consumers rationally, it's not that economists have access to stuff that these idiot consumers, no, that they have every reason to be nervous. I mean, things like the government borrowed $1.7 trillion last year. That's kind of a big number, and they're paying, more on interest expense than I think that it topped the Pentagon's budget this cycle. And, looking at projections going forward, like some of the stuff you did, Jonathan, at the Fort Myers event, showcasing, again, not going to the Heritage Foundation, let alone Alex Jones, looking at the Congressional Budget Office's own projections. If they just stay the course, even if there's not a recession, the debt just keeps piling up, even, as a share of the economy, the interest payments, it gets to the point where the government is going to be borrowing money to pay interest on the existing debt. And that just keeps, widening. So, people see that stuff. So it may be, of course, that they're getting that news funneled to them through, ideological channels. Like, so somebody who's very bearish and hates the Biden administration can grab that stuff and show it to them, but it's not that those numbers are made up or that that's not really a thing. And so I think that, people, and as we've shown here, Jonathan, like the yield curve massively inverted. It still hasn't fully even crossed back up. It actually bounced down again. I was looking at that, like in terms of, going back up to the 0 point, and it came back down. So, I mean, again, if we don't have a bad recession in 2024, that could happen. There's free will. Humans are not mindless automatons, but it would be a pretty big asterisk when people talk about an inverted yield curve signaling a recession. That, these are objective things. Also, just to circle back, I want to make sure people understood just, again, how Krugman tried to have it both ways with that debate. So, again, Larry Summers in the start of 2021 was warning and saying price inflation is getting out of hand. The Fed needs to tighten, and alas, that's going to cause unemployment to go up. I'm sorry to say that, folks, but, I'm here just to tell you the situation. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. And Krugman said, no, we don't need, the Fed shouldn't tighten because inflation is going to come down on its own. And the reason we shouldn't tighten is because if we tighten, it's going to cause a recession that's unnecessary. Because I'm telling you, folks, don't worry, inflation will come down on its own. So the Fed definitely tightened, whether you look at interest rates, which spiked, or money supply figures, which actually came down. So just they slowed the rate of growth. Price inflation subsided. It's still not where the Fed claims it wants it to be, but it definitely peaked and came down. And so Krugman, as of September, was warning, saying, okay, this is looking good. See, we were right. Inflation came down on its own. But if there is a recession, it's because the Fed tightened. So you notice the move he's making there. He's saying, Summers claimed Fed tightens, that's going to bring down inflation but cause a recession. And Krugman wants to say, even if a recession does happen, you would think, okay, Summers is totally right. The Fed tightened, inflation came down, and then there was a recession. And no, what Krugman's going to try to argue if there is a recession next year is he's going to say, yep, the Fed tightened, inflation came down, there was a recession, but Summers was wrong and I was right because inflation came down first. There wasn't technically a recession, in September or October of 2023. Therefore, that showed we didn't need to tighten for that to happen. And then this recession was just completely, an unnecessary byproduct of the stupid Fed tightening. So again, it's as Jonathan was saying, I think partly it's because their framework is different. The reason Krugman thinks that, just besides the fact that it allows him to be right, is that in their model, what drives everything is aggregate demand. And so, yes, if price inflation's coming down, it's because the Fed slammed on the brakes, it cooled off, and so spending came down. So that should be, synchronous with rising unemployment, right? There shouldn't be this huge lag of, why would price inflation come way down and then 6 months later recession start? But I'm saying in our framework, again, like looking at the inverted yield curve and things like that, if there's a recession that starts next year, certainly if it happens in the first 6 months, it's not like on the chart of historical recessions that would look weird, like, oh, wow, for some reason there was a real lag. No, that would be right on schedule, in terms of when the tightening happens. You and I, Jonathan, we went back to like looking at 2006 and 2007, people talking about a soft landing then. So we're still right on schedule. If a recession hits, like I say, especially if it's in the first half of 2024, there's no unusual lag between, what the Fed did to bring down price inflation and then a subsequent crash. So again, there might not be, but I'm just saying at this point, if there is a crash starting in March or something, it's not like, well, we can forgive those left-leaning economists for missing that because it certainly looked like everything was fine. Like, no, this is still right in the danger zone.
But what Krugman has done with his rhetoric over the past couple of years is he's covered his bases. So if and when the recession happens, he's got a line that he can say. So like you said, he could say, "See, I told you, if we tighten too much, then it's going to cause a recession." It reminds me of a magic trick. So any listeners who like being surprised by magic tricks should cover their ears or skip ahead a few seconds. But so one thing that a magician will do sometimes is they'll have the spectator make some sort of guess or make some sort of selection among a few alternatives, and then the mentalist, the magician, will dance around, do some fancy sorts of stuff, and eventually reveal that he knew what they were going to pick all along. But what the magician, and here's where I reveal the secret, what the magician has is they have cards and are ways to reveal the spectator's guess in multiple locations. So like maybe they have a balloon that they could pop that would reveal the spectator's guess, or maybe they have a card in their jacket pocket that they could pull out. See, this is what you selected, but the spectator doesn't know that the magician has all these other bases covered. All the other things that the spectator could have guessed or selected are somewhere else on the magician's person. So
okay, I actually didn't know that. So, but just so I understand, John, you're saying, like they say, go ahead, pick a card, any card, and the person looks at it and shows the crowd, and they don't show the magician, but he somehow knew what card they picked, and then just knows, okay, I got to find the 7 of diamonds. That's the one that I put in my right pocket, so that's where I'm going to pull it out of.
Yeah, that's one way. Yeah, so the sort of trick that I described works better if there's like just a few alternatives, like if there's 4 or 5 things that the spectator can pick. But like in the case of a card, like they have ways of forcing the selection of a card, and then they'll and then they have the big reveal. But sometimes they'll have like a backup. So like if the spectator accidentally picks something that the magician wasn't trying to force, then the magician has like this backup. See, and they'll say, so here's my real prediction right here. So like they've got like backups, like Krugman has backups. So no matter what happens, Krugman can say that he was right.
Yeah, definitely. You remind me, I think it was David Copperfield. It was like something
I did
on
not
TV.
intend to get into this.
This is more interesting than Krugman. It was on TV, so he's doing tricks like with, I think it was the one we made the statue. Maybe I'm getting mixed up, but in any event, he's doing calling the audience up and like, hey, examine this thing and show that it's really a glass, it's solid, and that's when he makes the person disappear. How did that happen? But one of them, it was for the viewer at home, and it like flashed some stuff, and there were multiple things on the screen and told you to pick one, and then it moved them around and did some, and then the thing you picked, it moved into the middle, and everything else disappeared. It said, this is what you picked. And so of course I'm looking at that thinking, well, it's not that they're somehow beaming this to my TV. Like this is the same image everybody in the country who's watching this is seeing. And so then I like thought back to how did they, and I don't remember now what the trick was, but there was some way that it made it look like you were choosing from many things when in fact, for some reason, the way it was designed, like everybody was gonna just choose the one thing. And then of course you picked this one, didn't you? And everyone's, oh my gosh, how did it know? It read my mind. And then, tailored it to my television set. That's amazing. So,
we're just spoiling everybody's fun, aren't we? We're spoiling Paul Krugman's rhetoric. We're spoiling the magician's fun.
Okay, so I suppose, Jonathan, maybe just to wrap this one up, I've noticed too. You've probably seen it. Like again, once the talking points get embedded and the two sides start clashing over it, it reinforces it. So among like smug economists now, anytime something comes, like I see people now making fun of like the price of eggs, because there was a period there where the price of eggs really went up high and people were complaining. And so then, Fox
the recent thing
News.
is orange juice. So
What's that?
Did you see orange juice is incredibly expensive now. That's like a commodity that's increasing in price, at least lately.
But the eggs became a football. I mean, they wouldn't be a very good one, but where people were jockeying, because then, the people on the right were pointing to that, like, yeah, thanks, Biden. And then the people on the left, again, just in the smug, like, oh, and then they came down at some point. And so now it's like a punchline among left-leaning economists that I see on Twitter all the time, where they, hey, remember when everyone was freaking out about eggs? And it's, again, it's just like normally that's what you would expect from people on the right. That, you know what I mean? Like they would use statistics and to dismiss, some sob story that, some individual family, the guy got laid off or whatever, and the Democrats are holding them up. And this is, the Reagan economy is leaving this family, and the people on the right would just be looking at aggregate statistics and, well, and most people are doing better. And and yet it's totally reversed now. It's the right is largely anti-war, well, except with Israel. And, and wanting to have discussions with Russia and blah, blah, blah. And it's the left who are real hawkish and are literally making fun of people who are complaining that food is expensive. It's just shocking.
Yeah. It's amazing. So all sorts of things are changing. And you're right. The sorts of shifts in the positions between the left and the right, it's been pretty spectacular to watch, not just since COVID, but really since Trump. So since 2016, right. There's been all sorts of like these shifts.
And again, I think partly the way it happens almost naturally is the two sides reinforce each other. So like, you grab a left-wing economist and you say, rising price inflation, is that good or bad for the bottom 20% of wage earners? They're not me sure, but to saying the opposite of what Fox News is reporting, they're sure that's the right thing to do. And so the fact that both sides kind of rotate simultaneously, I think reinforces it that they're sure, we're still arguing with those idiots over there, so we must be in the right.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of tribalism. One thing that I forgot to mention regarding consumer sentiment is that I noticed that credit card delinquency has gotten up to the same rates that they were in the 2007 and 2008 time period. So I think that there really is like a lot of like hard facts that are driving consumer sentiment to be as bad as it is now. And I think the economists who were just looking at the combination of price inflation and unemployment, they have this like really narrow view, and they're not taking the broader look. They're not considering the quality of goods. They're not considering maybe the effect of the bank failures that happened earlier this year and how that could be causing consumers to be pessimistic. Because I know you mentioned the yield curve, but I'm not sure that your average Joe is consulting the yield curve. Certainly those sorts of events trickle into just general financial reporting, and so that might cause them to be a little more skittish. But there's all sorts of things, like you said, the economy is not doing great. There's all sorts of things that could be causing the consumer to be more pessimistic, and for Paul Krugman to throw his hands up and say, it's those Republicans who are just angry that they're not in power, and that's what's causing this University of Michigan consumer sentiment survey to look so bad, even though if you look at inflation and unemployment, everything is going great. I think that's really just it's not fair, and it seems like he's just like I said, it's his own partisanship that's driving that conclusion, as opposed to actually looking at the data.
Yeah, and you're right. To be clear, I wasn't saying that the average household necessarily is consulting the yield curve every 3 weeks when they're making vacation plans, but that kind of stuff might be what the people they read, the pundits they read, or the news sources they rely on. Those people could be bearish because of objective things like that, and then that's filtering down to them as well. Okay, well, folks, we will link to Jonathan's article as well as some other resources of things we touched on today. Jonathan, as always, thanks for your time and your insights.
Thanks for having me, Bob. And I'm sorry I ruined your fun at your next magic show.
Yes, I will have to do something else at this point that involves rabbits. Well, I can't because I bet you rabbits are really expensive now, even though my wages have gone up. Thank you, folks, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.